My family confessed I was born as a medical spare part for my brother. They aborted 3 babies before getting me. Now I'm pregnant, and they'll never meet my child. I'm 24 years old. I work as an administrative assistant at a tech company, and I need to tell this story because what happened basically destroyed my entire family. Or well, what I thought was my family. The thing is, I grew up thinking it was normal, you know, that parents have favorites and all that, but it turns out mine wasn't just favoritism. It was something much darker and more twisted than I could have ever imagined. I should start at the beginning, I suppose. I grew up in a normal house in the suburbs of Chicago. Nothing fancy, but not bad either. Typical American middle class. My brother Connor is 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he was always the center of the universe for my parents. Like, when we were kids, if I got good grades, it was like, oh, that's nice, honey. But when Connor got an A, it was a whole celebration with a special dinner and everything. I don't know. I thought it was because he was the oldest, or because he was a boy. You know how some traditional families are. It bothered me a little when I was a kid, but then I kind of accepted it and moved on with my life. The weird thing is that my parents were always super attentive to Connor's health, like obsessively attentive. Any little thing that happened to him was cause for panic, while I could fall and break an arm and it was like put some ice on it and you'll be fine. I remember one time when I was like 8, Connor got a stomach bug. Nothing serious, but my parents rushed him to the emergency room and stayed all night with him at the hospital. I stayed with my Aunt Caroline that night, and I remember she was kind of upset with my parents, but I didn't understand why. Now I do understand. Boy, do I understand. Things got really intense about 2 years ago, when I was 22 and Connor was 26. It turns out Connor started having kidney problems, something genetic that nobody saw coming. Although looking back, I should have noticed the signs because my parents were too calm about it, as if they were already expecting it or something. They did a ton of tests on him and eventually told him he needed a transplant. And here comes the part where my life went completely to hell. Literally the day after we found out about the diagnosis, my parents sat me down in the living room, and my mom said, "Isabella, we need you to get some tests done to see if you're compatible with Connor." And I was like, sure, obviously, he's my brother. But something about the way they said it made me feel weird. It wasn't a question. You know what I mean? It was like an instruction, like when they tell you to take out the trash or wash the dishes. My dad just nodded and said, "It's your responsibility to help your brother. That's what family is for." I got the tests done, and sure enough, I was compatible, and my parents acted like they'd won the lottery. Connor was like kind of happy, but there was also something weird in his expression, as if he too had been expecting that result. So I started scheduling everything super fast, too fast, and I hadn't even officially said yes. One day, I went on my own to talk to the doctor who was going to do the surgery. Dr. Anderson, to better understand what all this involved because my parents only talked to me about how well Connor was going to do afterwards. The doctor explained the risks to me, that basically I was going to have to live with only one kidney for the rest of my life, that there was risk of complications, that my health insurance was probably going to skyrocket, that if I ever had health problems, I was going to be at a disadvantage, and that on top of that, they couldn't guarantee that the surgery was going to work for Connor. And then he asked me something that nobody else had asked me. "Do you really want to do this, Isabella? Or do you feel pressured?" And I broke down there. Honestly. Because it was the first time someone treated me like my decision mattered. I told him I needed time to think about it, and when I got home and told my parents I wanted to wait a bit and evaluate everything, well, all hell broke loose. My mom started yelling at me about how selfish I could be, that Connor was going to die without that kidney. What kind of sister was I? My dad was standing there telling me I was deeply disappointing him, that he never thought I could be so cruel. Connor wasn't saying anything, just staring at me with this total expression of betrayal, like I was stabbing him. I tried to explain to them what the doctor had told me, the risks for me, the fact that I also had a life and a future to consider, but it was like talking to a wall. And then my mom said something that froze my blood. She said exactly, "You were born to help him, Isabella. It's your purpose." And she just stood there looking at me like she'd just said the most normal thing in the world, while my brain was trying to process what the hell I'd just heard. I asked her what she meant by that, and she got all nervous. I started backtracking, saying, "No, she just meant that siblings help each other," but I knew there was something more. I left the house and went straight to my Aunt Caroline's, who had always been like my safe person in the family, you know? The one who defended me when my parents were unfair with Connor. The one who took me for ice cream when I was sad. I told her everything that had happened and she went pale, literally, like she'd seen a ghost. Caroline made me sit down and told me, "Isabella, I have to tell you something that your parents never wanted you to know." And she told me that when Connor was 4 years old, he got seriously ill, something with his bone marrow, and he needed an urgent transplant. My parents and Caroline weren't compatible, nobody in the family was. So my parents decided to have another child who could be a donor for Connor. And it wasn't a normal pregnancy, Caroline told me. They worked with a fertility specialist to make sure the baby would be genetically compatible with Connor. I was that baby. I mean, I was literally designed in a laboratory to save my brother. I sat there trying to process this, while Caroline explained to me that they did several genetic tests on me when I was born, and sure enough, I was compatible, that they took bone marrow from me when I was like 6 months old and transplanted it to Connor, and that was the reason my brother survived. I never knew any of this. They never told me, never explained to me why I existed. But wait, because it gets worse. Caroline told me that my parents didn't get it right on the first try. They had 3 pregnancies before me that ended in abortion because the fetuses weren't genetically compatible with Connor. 3. She was telling me that basically my parents discarded 3 of my possible siblings until they finally got the right product, until they got me, the perfect girl to save the son they really wanted. I felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. My whole life, every moment, every interaction with my parents, everything suddenly made sense in the most horrible way possible. They didn't love me less than Connor because I was the youngest or because I was a girl. They loved me less because I was literally a spare part, a source of pieces for the son they truly loved. Every time they compared me to him, every time they made me feel less important, it wasn't by accident or bad parenting. It was because to them I had a specific purpose, and beyond that I didn't matter. I asked Caroline how she knew all this, and she told me she'd been there. That she'd fought with my parents when they decided to do it. That she told them it was immoral. That it was using a human being as a means and not as an end. All those fancy words that I didn't understand well at the time, but that now make perfect sense to me. My parents stopped talking to her for years after that, and only recently had they resumed superficial contact. Caroline told me she always wanted to tell me, but didn't know how, and that she was afraid I wouldn't believe her or would destroy my relationship with my parents. I stayed at Caroline's house that night because I couldn't even think about going back to my house. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every moment of my childhood through this horrible new lens. You know when you realize your whole life has been a lie? That's how I felt. Like Isabella, the person I thought I was, had never actually existed. I was a project, an experiment, a tool. The next day, I went back to my house. He still lived with my parents back then because I was saving to move out. And I confronted them with everything. I asked them directly if it was true that they had conceived me to be Connor's donor, and my mom started crying and my dad told me I didn't understand, that they loved me, that they'd only done what any parent would do to save their child. And I screamed at them, "But what about me? Did you ever think of me as your daughter? Or was I always just medical insurance for Connor?" My mom tried to hug me and I told her not to touch me. I told her I wasn't going to donate the kidney to Connor, that I was going to live my life for myself and not to be his personal spare part. Connor was there and he exploded, started yelling at me that I was selfish, that he never asked to be born sick, that I owed him my life because our parents had given me a family. I told him, our parents didn't give me anything, that they created me with a specific purpose, and beyond that, they never really cared about me. Things got super ugly after that. My parents told me that if I didn't donate the kidney, I had to leave the house. I packed my bags that same night and went to live with Caroline. My parents started sending me horrible messages, telling me I was a murderer, that I was going to have Connor's death on my hands, that I was a heartless monster. Connor sent me a message saying he'd never really loved me, that he always knew I was different, and now he understood why. I thought that was the worst that could happen. But oh, surprise, Connor decided to escalate things. About 2 weeks after I'd left the house, I was driving back from work and the police pulled me over. They said they'd received an anonymous tip that my car had drugs in it. And sure enough, they found a bag of marijuana hidden under the passenger seat. I went into total panic because I've never used drugs. I don't even smoke cigarettes, and I swore to them that someone had planted that there. They handcuffed me and took me to the station, and it was the most humiliating and terrifying experience of my life. I called Caroline and she came with a lawyer. And thank God the lawyer was good because he asked to review the security cameras from where I'd parked my car that day. And there it was, clear as day. Connor approaching my car, looking around to make sure nobody saw him, and putting something through the window that I'd left, halfway open. When they showed the video to the police, things changed completely. Now, Connor was the suspect, and I was the victim. They arrested him that same night, and my parents went to the police station literally to yell at me, in front of all the cops, that I had ruined Connor's life? How dare I press charges against my own brother who was sick and desperate? The lawyer had to ask the cops to remove them because they were harassing me. Connor ended up confessing everything. He said he'd thought that if I had legal problems, my parents could use that to force me to donate the kidney in exchange for their help. Or something twisted like that. I don't know. His logic made no sense to me. They gave him probation because it was his first offense. And because my parents' lawyer, yes, they paid for a lawyer for him but never offered me help, argued he was under emotional stress from his illness. But I went ahead with the charges because, you know what? I was fed up. Fed up with Connor, getting away with everything. Fed up with my parents defending him no matter what he did. Fed up with being treated like I was the problem. Connor eventually went to prison for 6 months, and my parents acted like I'd killed someone. They stopped talking to me completely, told the whole family I was a psychopath who was trying to destroy Connor. Most of the family believed them, or at least pretended to believe them. Cousins I'd grown up with stopped responding to my messages. Uncles and aunts who'd known me since I was a baby blocked me on social media. It was like suddenly I was the villain in a story where I was the only real victim. You know what I mean? But Caroline stayed with me. And her daughter, my cousin Maya, also supported me. And some more distant cousins who'd always thought my parents were weird also took my side. Then my parents did something that really left me frozen. They created a GoFundMe for Connor, telling a whole story about how their cruel and selfish daughter refused to save her innocent brother's life, and that they needed money for Connor's medical treatments while they waited to find another donor. The story they told painted me as a monster, basically. They said Connor had made a small mistake out of desperation, and that I'd sent him to prison for it. The GoFundMe went kind of viral in our community, and suddenly there were people I didn't even know, sending me hate messages, telling me they hoped I'd die, that I was human garbage. How could I sleep at night knowing my brother was suffering? Someone even found out where I worked and called my boss trying to get me fired. They didn't succeed. Thank God my boss is a good person and saw that it was all family drama. But I still had to deal with weird looks from some coworkers for weeks. That's when Caroline suggested I talk to Dr. Anderson, the doctor who'd treated me when I was a baby. It turns out he was already retired, but Caroline knew where he lived. We went to see him and I explained the whole situation, and he looked super uncomfortable, like nervous and guilty. He told me he'd assisted at my birth and that he remembered the case because it was very unusual at that time. This was in 2000, when savior siblings or designer babies weren't as common yet. Dr. Anderson asked me if my parents had told me the complete truth, and I told him I only knew what Caroline had told me. He sighed and told me that my parents had worked with a pretty controversial fertility specialist who'd done the pre-implantation genetic screening to make sure I'd be compatible with Connor, and that yes, they'd terminated 3 previous pregnancies because they weren't compatible. He gave me copies of my medical records from when I was a baby, where the whole bone marrow transplant process was documented. I asked him if that was legal, and he told me technically yes, although ethically it was very questionable. He explained that in 2000 there weren't many regulations about this, and that the doctor who'd done the procedure had done several similar cases. He gave me the name of the fertility specialist, Dr. Mitchell, and suggested that if I wanted to fight against my parents' narrative, those medical records were solid proof of the truth. I took those records and, with the help of the lawyer Caroline had gotten me, made them public. Well, not completely public, but we showed them to the extended family and some key people in our community who were involved with the GoFundMe. The reaction was immediate. Suddenly, people started to understand that it wasn't simply a selfish sister refusing to help, but someone who had literally been created to be a medical spare part and was trying to establish boundaries. The GoFundMe was reported and eventually shut down for false information and manipulation. My parents were furious. They sent me a super long message telling me I'd ruined Connor's only chances of getting help, that I was vindictive, that I was destroying the family out of pride. But I didn't care anymore, honestly. I'd reached a point where I realized I couldn't keep trying to win the love of people who never saw me as a complete person. Things got more complicated when medical authorities started investigating Dr. Mitchell, the fertility specialist who'd helped my parents. It turns out my case wasn't the only one. He'd done this procedure for like 15 different families, some even more extreme than mine. There was a huge scandal. It was on the local news and everything, and eventually they took away his license. Some of the other families came forward to speak publicly about their experiences, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone in this. I met other people who'd been savior siblings, some who'd donated bone marrow like me, others who'd donated kidneys or parts of their liver, and we all had similar stories of feeling less valued than our siblings, of carrying that horrible pressure of being responsible for another person's life. From the moment we were born. It was sad but also comforting, in a way, to know I wasn't crazy, that my experience was real and valid. While all this was happening, Connor got out of prison and my parents received him like he was a war hero returning home. They posted photos on Facebook of the reunion, with captions about the power of family, love, and forgiveness. And it was so hypocritical, it was sickening. Because they never forgave me for setting boundaries, but they forgave Connor for literally committing a crime against me. The priorities were super clear. Connor started posting on social media about his illness, looking for donors, telling his story but obviously leaving out the part where he'd planted drugs on me and all that. My parents shared all his posts, and they kept not mentioning me except as the selfish sister who'd refused to help. I blocked them all at that point because I couldn't keep seeing that shit. Sorry for the language, but it made me sick. Eventually, Connor found a donor through an organ donation program from someone deceased. I think, or maybe from the waiting list. I'm not completely sure, because obviously nobody kept me informed. My parents posted a triumphant announcement about how Connor had received his transplant and was recovering well. And there were all these comments from people congratulating them and saying it was a miracle and God provides and blah blah blah. Part of me felt relief that Connor was okay. I'm not going to lie, because despite everything I didn't want him to die. But another part of me was furious because my parents acted like their prayer and their faith had saved Connor, when the reality is that I simply refused to be sacrificed on the altar of their devotion to him. And they never, not once, acknowledged the harm they'd done to me, never apologized, never admitted that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong. A few months after Connor's transplant, my parents tried to make one last move to manipulate me. They posted on Facebook that Connor had attempted suicide from depression and guilt about everything that had happened, and that he was in the hospital. Several family members wrote to me saying I needed to go see him, that he was asking for me, that if I didn't go and something happened to him, it would be my fault. But something sounded off. You know, after everything that had happened, I didn't trust anything they said. So I called the hospital where Connor supposedly was and asked to speak with him or confirm he was there, and the person at reception told me they didn't have any patient with that name. I called other hospitals in the area. Nothing. Connor wasn't in any hospital. I sent Connor a text message directly, telling him I hoped he was okay, and he responded super quick with something like, "Thanks for caring. I'm at home recovering." I mean, he wasn't in any hospital. He hadn't attempted anything. It was all another lie from my parents trying to make me feel guilty and make me come back. When I realized that, something broke definitively in me. It wasn't pain or betrayal anymore. It was just nothing. Empty. Like when you get so tired of feeling that you simply stop feeling. I reported the false post to the authorities because in our state it's illegal to make false reports of medical or psychiatric crises, and also to Facebook for false information. The post was removed, and my parents received a warning from the police, though nothing more happened to them beyond that. But the damage to their reputation was already done, because people in the community started to realize that something was very wrong with them. Even some family members who'd previously supported them started to distance themselves. My uncle Roberto, my mom's brother, called me to apologize for judging me without knowing the whole story. He told me he'd always thought my mom was a bit intense, but never imagined to what extent. That conversation made me cry. I'm not going to lie, because it was the first time someone from that side of the family validated me. I decided to move completely, get away not just from my parents, but from that whole city and those memories. Caroline helped me with the move, and I ended up in a city about 6 hours away, a place where nobody knew my story, and I could start from zero. I got a better job, a decent apartment, and started therapy because, well, I obviously needed it after all this mess. Therapy helped me understand I wasn't crazy, that my anger and pain were completely valid, and that setting boundaries with my parents didn't make me a bad person. My therapist explained to me that what my parents did had a name. It's called instrumental parentification. When parents see their children as tools to fulfill a specific purpose instead of as individuals with inherent value. And we also talked a lot about rejection, trauma, and how that had affected all my relationships. I met my fiancé, Jason, about a year after moving. We met at work. He's a graphic designer, and I was already a project coordinator by that point. At first, I didn't tell him anything about my story because, honestly, how do you explain to a normal person that your parents created you in a laboratory to be a medical spare part for your brother? But eventually, when things got serious between us, I had to tell him everything. I was super nervous about how he was going to react. I thought maybe he'd run away because, I'm not going to lie, my story is heavy. But Jason listened to me without interrupting, and when I finished telling him everything, the only thing he said was, "Your parents are idiots for not seeing how incredible you are, and no human being should be created with conditions as if they were a product." And then he hugged me and let me cry. And it was the first time I felt like someone saw me completely. Not as Connor's sister or as the rebellious daughter, but as Isabella. Just Isabella. Jason proposed to me about 6 months ago, and obviously I said yes. We're not inviting my parents or Connor, obviously. Caroline will be there, and Maya, and some other relatives from my dad's side who eventually understood the situation. It's going to be a small wedding, intimate, exactly how I want it to be, without drama or manipulation. And here comes the part I still can't believe. I'm pregnant. 3 months. When I saw the test result, I cried for like an hour, because suddenly I realized I was going to be a mom, that I was going to have this little person who's going to depend on me, and I was terrified of becoming like my parents, of ruining my child the same way they ruined me. But Jason reminded me that the fact that I'm worried about that already makes me different from them, because they never question their actions for even a second. I've thought a lot about what kind of mother I want to be, and the conclusion I came to is simple. I want to love my child unconditionally, without expectations or hidden purposes, just because they exist and because they're my child. I want them to know that their value doesn't depend on what they can do for others, but simply on being who they are. I want to be everything my parents never were for me. My parents don't know I'm pregnant, and I don't plan to tell them. They're not going to meet my child. They're not going to have the opportunity to do to him or her what they did to me. Connor's not going to have contact either, although lately I've heard through third parties that he's in good health after the transplant and that he started dating someone. Which I'm glad about, I guess. Not because I particularly care about his happiness, but because it means he's busy with his own life and not trying to ruin mine. Sometimes I wake up at night and think about everything that happened, about how my whole life was a lie until I was 22. And I wonder who I would have been if I'd been born into a normal family. If they'd loved me for myself and not for what I could give, Connor. But then I see Jason sleeping next to me, and I think about the baby growing inside me. And I realize that despite everything horrible, I managed to get out. I managed to build a real life. I managed to find people who truly love me. Last week, Caroline came to visit me, and we were setting up the baby's room. While we were painting the walls a soft yellow, she asked me if I'd ever forgive my parents. And the truth is, I don't know. Forgiveness is complicated when people never acknowledge they did anything wrong, you know? You can't forgive someone who doesn't think they need forgiveness. And besides, forgiving doesn't mean letting them back into your life. It doesn't mean exposing yourself to that pain again. I told Caroline that maybe someday I can forgive them in my heart, for me, to free myself completely from that weight, but that doesn't mean I'm going to have a relationship with them. She nodded and told me she was proud of me, that I'd been so strong in breaking the cycle, in refusing to continue being a victim of their manipulations. She told me that her sister, my mom, had missed the opportunity to know the incredible woman I'd become, and that was her loss, not mine. Now I'm 24 years old. I'm going to be a mom in 6 months. I'm getting married in 3 months, and I finally feel like my life belongs to me. I'm no longer a spare part. I'm no longer a means to an end. I'm just Isabella, and that's enough. This baby is going to be born into a family that's going to love them unconditionally, that's going to celebrate their existence not for what they can do, but simply for existing. And that, after everything I went through, feels like the biggest victory of all.